In this episode of The Atomic Zone, Death visits an unlikable man to let him know that he is being checkmated. That is, his death is inevitable, but because Death is compassionate and cannot stand to see people suffer, he is offering the man a chance to come willingly before the inevitable final moment. His doom is assured, and it will not be pleasant. Our story begins with a man in his kitchen fixing himself a drink. Meet Fred Witherspoon, businessman, husband, and law-abiding con artist of the highest caliber. A successful man whose fortune is made at the expense of innocent people, whose only mistake is answering the phone and being too polite to hang up while they are artfully scammed out of their hard-earned money. Today has been a particularly difficult day for Fred. Telemarketers call out sick. Banks threaten to freeze his accounts. Differences of opinion with his computer staff result in chairs being thrown. To Fred, the world is filled with obstinate, incompetent, lying, lazy, confrontational people, none of whom can ever live up to his standards. In reality, the world he perceives is entirely manufactured by, and always reacting to, his own hostility, stupidity, and greed. But Fred is the kind of man who would never even consider that he might be the cause of his own problems. Sitting in the dark living room is Fred's wife, Alice. She is quiet, still, and terrified, defensively clutching a small pillow. She hears him pull his car into the garage at 8 p.m. like clockwork and enter through the kitchen door, and with him comes the dark shadow of terror, abuse, and potential violence. The sound of a phone call not going well on his end, the rustle of shopping bags, and the clink of liquor bottles. In the kitchen, Fred makes himself a stiff drink, then turns to find where he has just thrown his cell phone, caring less about the cost of replacing it than about venting his anger over the injustice of being held accountable. And that is when he sees the man, not really a man, more like a thing. It is Death. Death Jr., actually. Fred immediately shouts an expletive at the intruder and looks around for something he can use as a weapon. Death calmly introduces himself to Fred Witherspoon. Fred demands to know who the hell he is while brandishing a mop handle like it is the deadliest weapon on earth. Death simply explains that he is Death. Fred curses at him again and swings the mop handle directly at Death Jr.'s hooded head. But at the exact moment of contact, Death vanishes and reappears 3 feet to the left. Fred swings again, and Death repeats the maneuver to the right. It suddenly becomes clear to Fred that whatever he is attacking is not a man, but a specter, hallucination, or unbelievably good trick. Fred tries to bring the mop handle crashing straight down onto Death Jr.'s head, but once again the space occupied by the ghoul becomes empty just before impact, and instead Fred shatters a glass coffee pot. In the living room, Alice hears the shouting and the sound of breaking glass coming from the kitchen. She is not curious. She is not concerned about Fred. She simply tenses up, adrenaline stinging her shoulders, nausea welling up in her stomach, as if she already knows that whatever is happening in the kitchen is eventually going to happen to her too, and there is nothing she can do about it except wait and hope. Sometimes it does not happen. Sometimes the alcohol calms him down. Most of the time it does not. Most of the time she is made to pay the price for something terrible that Fred likely caused himself earlier that day. But then the kitchen suddenly becomes quiet. To Alice, this means her evening now has a 50-50 chance of either going well or turning into a marathon session of insults and injuries, apologies, a drunken assault in the bedroom, and a long night of crying into her pillow. It never once crosses her mind that there might be a third option unfolding in that kitchen. Fred reaches for the folds of Death Jr.'s robe but grabs only air. He swings again and again, but Death Jr. simply winks in and out of the way every time. Finally, after a long pause, Fred begins to accept the truth. This is really happening. Fred gently sets down the mop handle, takes a long sip of his drink, and quietly asks who the figure really is. Death repeats that he is Death. After another long silence, Fred simply nods and asks what Mr. Death is doing there. Death Jr. explains that Mr. Death is actually his father, and that he himself is just Death Jr. He then informs Fred that he is in checkmate. Death lets the phrase settle between them. This is a conversation Death has had countless times, with very few variations. Death asks Fred if he understands chess. He explains that as a chess game advances, strategies and deceptions unfold, pieces are taken, and slowly, inevitably, victory and defeat close in around the board. But the final move, the actual taking of the king, is usually avoided with the simple pronouncement of checkmate, the inescapable defeat, and the concession, the civilized acceptance that the end has already arrived. Normally there is no dramatic knocking over of the king, no final death blow to the piece, just a civilized agreement among civilized players that the game has come to an end. Winner, loser, game over. Fred's mind squirms for an angle, an argument, a negotiation, some way to regain his sanity and return to reality, to stop whatever fantasy is happening to him right now. Death, clearly understanding Fred's thoughts, continues explaining that the inevitable end has come for Fred, and that he is here to collect a soul. Again reading Fred's thoughts through his expression, Death explains that the details no longer matter. How Fred dies is irrelevant. The simple fact is that there is no avoiding it now. There is no time left to change direction, no time for an ambulance, no sudden Dickensian realization that fixes everything. Death explains that he is there to collect a soul, and he is not leaving without one because he does not have a choice. Fred, however, still has one choice left. He can come willingly now, checkmate, or they can sit there and wait for the inevitable end to arrive naturally. Death warns him that if they wait, it will be the most unpleasant experience Fred has ever endured. It will be slow, and there will be suffering. Death explains, almost sadly, that he hates suffering. He has seen too much of it. The two of them can skip that part now. There is no escaping the end, but Fred still has the opportunity to concede and avoid the bad part. Death hefts his heavy scythe and casually explains that when the final moment comes, he has to start hitting people with it, and sometimes it goes on for hours. Death gives Fred a moment to think. Finally, Fred mutters, "That old Warren Beatty movie? Heaven Can Wait? What if you're mistaken?" Death Jr.'s posture becomes more relaxed and conversational. He explains that many people ask that exact question. He admits he has never actually seen the movie, but explains that Death does not make mistakes. He only has one job, and he does not even want to do it. When he appears, it is just as much against his will as it is against Fred's. It is simply the laws of physics, the universe being the universe. Finally, after another long silence, Death Jr. sees Fred's acceptance beginning to settle in and asks if there is anyone Fred wants to say goodbye to. A wife, for instance? Fred finishes his drink, pours another, and finishes that one too. "No," he says, and slams his cup down. The sound startles Alice. She hugs herself tighter. After years of learning the patterns, the sequence, every tiny nuance, breath, and footstep, she knows instantly that the sound means she is out of time and that things are about to go very badly. Except once again she is mistaken. In the kitchen, Fred makes one final attempt to negotiate. He asks if there is truly nothing he can do. Death explains that there is technically one possibility. Fred's face immediately fills with desperate hope. Death explains that he has to leave with a soul, but it does not specifically have to be Fred's. If someone else willingly sacrifices themselves in Fred's place, Fred could live. Fred does not even hesitate. "Take my wife." Death simply pauses silently. The sacrifice, Death explains, must go willingly, in Fred's place, to save him. The person must willingly take Death's hand and come along. Fred quietly repeats the word willingly. Death repeats the condition, "in your place, to save you." Fred's final hope evaporates. One more quick drink, one more slam of the glass, and then finally, "Let's go, Mr. Death." Death reaches out his hand, Fred takes it, and the reality around them evaporates. Death and Fred are gone. And just like that, Fred is dead. But this is the atomic zone, and this is not quite the end of the story. Fred and Death Jr. suddenly appear in a plain white waiting room with several doors but no windows. The room contains comfortable chairs, small tables covered with magazines, a few potted plants, and a large mounted television silently showing the Fox News channel. On one wall hangs a poster of Mr. Death pointing directly toward the viewer like the famous Uncle Sam recruitment poster. Standing beside one open doorway is a much larger, more foreboding version of Death, apparently Mr. Death himself. Next to him stands a young man in light blue scrubs with a lanyard around his neck and a large badge displaying Mr. Death's face and a barcode. The young man studies a clipboard with visible confusion and sarcastically calls out a name. "Alice." Mr. Death points a bony finger toward Fred, perfectly matching the pose from the recruitment poster, and exclaims, "Who the hell is this?" Death Jr. raises his and Fred's still joined hands in a gesture of formal introduction and proudly announces that this is Fred. The man in scrubs loudly flips through pages on his clipboard while repeating Fred's name to himself. Then Death Jr. casually adds a single word. "Sacrifice." Fred's eyes dart upward as his mind begins racing. The young man with the clipboard finds the correct page and reads aloud, "Fred the husband, sacrifice for Alice." "Yeah," Death Jr. says confidently, as though the matter is already settled. He immediately begins dragging Fred toward one of the doors. Mr. Death snatches the clipboard away and dramatically glances at the papers before loudly repeating, "Sacrifice for Alice." "He came willingly," Death Jr. explains defensively. "Did you checkmate him?" "No," Death Jr. says, immediately correcting himself. "I mean, yeah." Fred, still glancing around in confusion, finally begins piecing things together. "Hey, wait a minute!" At that exact moment, the young man in scrubs grabs Fred's other hand and cheerfully announces, "Come on, let's go! We weren't expecting to see you for another 50 years. The two of them vanish in a brilliant flash of light. Silence settles over the room as Mr. Death and Death Jr. simply stare at one another. "What the heck? You're taking him to heaven." Mr. Death, unable to show irritation through facial expression, conveys it entirely through stillness and slow, exhausted movements. He explains, as though repeating a rule he is tired of explaining, "All sacrifices go to heaven. This is all on you, son." Death Jr. cries, "But this was the night he was going to kill her." "All sacrifices go to heaven," Mr. Death repeats. Death Jr. whines and asks if he gets no credit at all for this one. "All sacrifices go to heaven," Mr. Death repeats yet again, even more exasperated this time. Then he finally adds, "Unless you go get the woman too, then he's no longer a sacrifice." Just a stupid, evil fool. Back at the home, Alice has fallen asleep on the couch in the dark, still clutching her pillow protectively, her posture of terror frozen in place even in sleep. Death Jr. appears silently behind the couch, in a soft flash of light. Alice stirs but does not wake up. Death Jr. studies her quietly for a moment, then lowers his scythe to the side, bends down, and kisses the top of her head. "He will never hurt you again," Death Jr. says softly. "You're free. See you in 50 years. And that is the end of one story, but the beginning of another, better one, in the Atomic Zone.